Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is United States History 201, and this is Presentation 9, the New Federal Republic and the Articles of Confederation. So we've talked about the American War for Independence, the United States as separate states, actually. This is the interesting thing about the Declaration, and, of course, the Treaty of Paris. The states were recognized independently. So these states have now been given their independence, and so we have this new Federal Republic. It's not a singular republic, it's a Federal Republic of independent states, or a Confederation of independent states. So we're going to talk about that with the Articles of Confederation, the first governing document, and some of the things that are going on there in this new Federal Republic during this time period, and then of course this will bridge into the Constitution. So in 1776, the states declared their independence from the British, and as Jefferson said in the Declaration, these were free and independent states. And so these independent states were the same as Great Britain. The state of Virginia was the same as the state of Great Britain. So they thought that they needed a union of these states so that you would have defense and perhaps commerce, international trade, hammered out for the common good. So in 1776, John Dickinson drafts the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. Now, what does that perpetual part mean? Well, it simply means there's no end date to the Union. It doesn't mean that it can't end. You don't have an end date. Okay, where we're going to end at this day at this time. It's perpetual, meaning the Union will be perpetual as long as the parties to the compact agree to it. That's all perpetual means. This was a compact between states, just like the Constitution is a compact between states. So this wasn't formally ratified till 1781, but it is the first governing document for the general government. And it is a federation or confederation of independent states, as it says so in Article 2 of the Articles of Confederation. So a loose confederation of independent states, each state retained its sovereignty and independence. It had a unicameral legislature. Congress was the only power. The executive was simply the presiding officer of Congress. There are 11 men in that position, including John Hancock and Richard Henry Lee. The judicial functions were handled by the Congress. So this is disputes between states. State courts handled the rest. Each state had one vote, so you could send 2 to 7 representatives, but it didn't matter because each state had one vote in this government. And it took a 2/3 majority to approve any legislation. Now it also must be emphasized that legislation was resolutions, not laws. So the Congress would resolve to do the following. They were resolved to do this, but when you start talking about resolutions, sometimes those don't have the same weight as law. For example, the United Nations today passes resolutions all the time, but the sovereign governments don't have to necessarily follow those resolutions. So the Articles formed a very weak central authority, and the states had a tremendous amount of control in this. But it must be emphasized, when we get to the Constitution, much of this doesn't change. The general idea stays the same, and I'll talk about that when we get there, but people seem to think the Constitution just destroyed the Articles, the whole principles of the Articles are gone. It's not true. A lot of those same principles were brought into the new Constitution. In fact, that's the way it was argued. That's what the framers argued they were doing, and of course the proponents of the Constitution argued they were doing when the Constitution was being ratified by the states. Now, the Congress, under the Articles, could handle foreign relations. They could appropriate and borrow money. But they did not have the power to tax through tariffs. They didn't have the power to regulate trade, draft troops, or tax the people directly. They had to make formal requests to the states to do any of the above. So they had very limited powers. And that was by design. Because if you think about it, most American leaders are not willing to cede power to a new central authority. They just declared their independence from one. All states already had written constitutions and republican forms of government, so why do they need another level of that? And they didn't need a strong executive. George III was a strong executive. It didn't work out for them there, so why do they need one now? So that was the idea. That what we just waged a war from 1775 to 1783 to get rid of this centralized power, this strong executive, this centralized taxing authority, etc., etc. We don't want that here. So Virginia taxes itself and governs itself largely, and then you have this loose confederation for defense and commerce, sort of. But that's going to break down at times. So, major issues under the Articles. Well, Western land we're going to talk a lot about. But of course, there are also so-called problems. Critics pointed to a number of problems that arose after independence. So they called for a stronger central government. These problems included trade problems, treasury and currency problems, hostile tribes on the frontier, and unrest in the colonies. And there wasn't a central army to address these issues. So these were considered problems that needed to be addressed, which is why eventually there will be the Philadelphia Convention in 1787, then a new constitution written and ratified. So let's talk about the Western land issue first. States would begin to cede their Western land to the general government beginning in 1782, but the major and most important cession was Virginia in 1784. This became known as the Northwest Territory. Now, Virginia had acquired this land during the war through George Rogers Clark. Basically, all of this was Virginia. And other states claimed it, but they really didn't have the same kind of claim that Virginia had. Virginia went out there and got this land. And so the land I'm talking about is everything here in the yellow. George Rogers Clark had acquired this for the state of Virginia during the war. So this actually at one time was called Augusta County, Virginia. Everything here was Augusta County, which is pretty amazing. Now, 1784, Jefferson devises a plan to organize new states from the Western Territory. This formed the basis of the Land Ordinance of 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which we'll talk about. The Land Ordinance of 1785 organized the Northwest Territory into 6 square-mile townships. Each township contained 36 lots at 640 acres each. One lot had to be set aside for public schools, and this land was to be sold at $1 an acre. So it's going to raise revenue for the central government, but it's also going to allow people to go out there and buy land and establish homesteads and farms, which is what you need to populate this area. So this is what it looked like. This is his idea. And you have these square lots. Now, this established a government, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 established a government for the new territory. It created a framework for 3 to 5 new states. But new states had to be on equal footing with the existing states, meaning that they weren't subservient to the already established states. They were states just like Virginia or Massachusetts or South Carolina. Same thing. Each state retained its sovereignty and independence. These states would have their sovereignty and independence, just like the states that were already in the United States government or in the Union. Now, slavery was prohibited in the new territory, but not the new states. So what Jefferson is doing here is prohibiting slavery. And he realizes that once you do that in the territory, you won't have it in the new states. But if these states ever did want to have slavery, that was up to them. So if Indiana wanted to be a slave state, they could do it, or Illinois or Ohio. Of course, the chances of that happening are very slim. But this is what was argued. States could make a decision on their own. The territory, the government could regulate the territory, at least at this point. This is going to be a big issue. We'll talk about this as we move forward. So this is the Northwest Territory, and these are all the states that eventually are created out of the Northwest Territory, also with the Louisiana Purchase. Now, other issues. Currency in the United States fluctuated by state. Most of it was paper and worthless. You had very high inflation. So there was a call for a central bank in Pennsylvania. It was defeated by the state legislature there, but eventually we'll get a central bank in the United States. If you can't get it in Pennsylvania, get it in the United States. States could pass tariffs against other states. There were no free economic zones, so there was interstate trade was highly regulated. Taxes and unemployment were very high, particularly in places like Massachusetts. There were continuing Indian problems on the frontier, and there was no army to address the situation. So people were pointing to all these issues and saying, we've got to do something. For example, in 1786, you had something called Shays' Rebellion. Very high taxes and economic distress led former soldiers to armed revolts against the Massachusetts government. Samuel Adams believed that these men should have been hung for treason. And so these men were dusting off old battle cries, no taxation without representation. They were saying that they had just fought the same thing with the British just a few years before. Why are they dealing with this out of their own state government? Adams, of course, who was an ardent patriot, said, well, there's a difference there. We had no representation in Great Britain, but we have it here, so you got to pay these taxes. But there was no central army to put this down. And so people thought something needed to be done to quell domestic unrest in the states. So in 1785, you have something called the Mount Vernon Conference meeting. This is the year before Shays' Rebellion. Maryland and Virginia would hammer out trade disagreements with Washington presiding. This is the first time you really had the states get together and try to have some type of agreement that could solve some of the economic difficulties. Well, this conference later led to the Annapolis Conference in 1786. 5 states would meet to discuss economic difficulties under the Articles of Confederation, and the 2 most important individuals at this Annapolis Conference were Alexander Hamilton of New York, pictured at left, and James Madison of Virginia. Well, they didn't have a quorum. Only 5 states, you can't do anything. So Hamilton and Madison ingeniously called for a convention of all the states to discuss several issues with the Articles in Philadelphia the next year. This will lead to the Philadelphia Convention, which we'll talk about in the next presentation. So Alexander Hamilton and James Madison are going to be the driving forces behind this Philadelphia Convention, and Madison himself will be a driving force behind this new Constitution. He's called the father of the Constitution, really a misnomer because the Constitution that Madison wanted he didn't get. But regardless, we're starting to see collective action, and of course, these states will get together in Philadelphia in 1787 and start talking about this new governing document for the United States. All right, we'll pick up with that next time, and I'll see you in Presentation 10.